If you're familiar with anime, and it'd be weird if you were watching this and you weren't, then you know that a ton of anime gets produced every year, including a bunch of titles that casual anime fans will never even hear about, let alone watch. And because it can be easy sometimes for certain shows to slip through the cracks, a while ago, I made it a personal tradition of mine to try to check out the first episode of every new anime that comes out every season. And I do this in an effort to see if there are any hidden gems out there that I might otherwise never even hear about or only hear about way later. And it's not a foolproof system by any means, especially because lots of good shows don't have good first episodes. But this tradition has helped me discover cool shows in real time that I otherwise might have never even heard about. And that is how I learned about the topic of this video, You and I Are Polar Opposites. It's one of those anime shows that has a whole sentence for its name. And I had never heard of You and I Are Polar Opposites. I went into it completely fresh. I started watching it as a formality more than anything. Like, I was fully prepared to start skimming through it if I started to lose interest in it. And not only did I watch its entire first episode, I came away from its first episode knowing that I was already a committed fan of this series. You and I Are Polar Opposites not only has a great first episode, it has one of the very best first episodes that I've ever seen from an anime show. Like, I was totally caught off guard by how fantastic this show opens. And I actually rewatched its first episode immediately after I saw it the first time because I was like, I have to experience this again. Like, that's how much I enjoyed this. And it made me realize that there's only been a few other times in my life that I've ever reacted so positively to the first episode of an anime show. And to commemorate why I felt this episode was so especially good, I figured it'd be fun to go over it here and analyze what about it I thought was so effective. And so, that's what I'm going to do. And it should go without saying that I'm about to completely spoil the first episode, so if you want to watch this first episode and you still haven't seen it yet, you should totally go and do it. Maybe it'll be up your alley, maybe it won't, but if it is, you'll be glad that you saw it without knowing precisely what was going to happen in it. Okay. So, the first thing to know about You and I Are Polar Opposites is that it's a romantic comedy, as you might have guessed by the title. It's a show about a high school girl named Suzuki, who kind of looks like an amalgamation of Sailor Moon and Haruko Harahara and Himiko Toga, and who, it turns out, has a massive crush on the guy who sits next to her in class named Tani. And the first few minutes of this show do a really good job of letting you know what this show has going for it. For instance, we see right away that this show is going to have a light tone. It's going to be kind of silly. The music that's playing at the start is very upbeat, and the characters that we see are all super down to earth. And so, right off the bat, you know that you're going to get a show that's not going to be uncomfortable. In fact, in the first few minutes of this show, Suzuki has a discussion with her friends about the fake eyelashes that she's wearing. And that is there to let the audience know that this show was made by someone who understands the female perspective and women's cosmetics. Because most guys would not be willing or able to write a scene about girls casually talking about makeup without it feeling forced or unconvincing. And what all of this does is establish to the viewers that this show isn't going to be raunchy or distasteful. And the reason that matters is because, as any good anime fan knows, anime shows have not always done the best job of portraying women. And to be more specific, this is the type of show that historically might have a lot of fan service in it. But You and I Are Polar Opposites lets you know from the get-go that not only is that not the case with this show is going to be primarily from the girl's perspective and is going to be respectful of her. And so, if you're new to this series, the opening of this show is very disarming because you quickly get the sense that you can trust it. You get the sense that even if you don't necessarily like this show is not going to offend your sensibilities or disgust you in some way. And that's a critical thing to establish when that is not the case with many, many other shows that are like this. Alright, so after the opening credits, which are really cool by the way, we learn a little bit more about Suzuki and why she loves Tani so much. And something I appreciated about this setup is that the show lays it out there that Suzuki has a very active social life. She has a bunch of friends that she hangs out with all the time, and she posts things on social media and even has certain entertainers that she's really into. And the reason I appreciated all of this is that a lot of anime shows with a premise like this would depict the girl in question in a way that's kind of pathetic. Like they'd make her out to be one-dimensional or a tsundere, or more or less distill her entire personality into only being about the guy that she's into. But with Suzuki, that's not the case. We see that she has a life outside of Tani, and that while she is in love with him, and while she has all these anxieties and struggles that are keeping her from ever actually doing anything with him, it's not because she's a weak person. You and I are polar opposites once you do identify with Suzuki. And that's not something that a lot of anime rom-coms ask of their audience. There are very few romantic comedy shows that are both this dedicated to focusing on their female lead and this dedicated to building them up as a three-dimensional character in the beginning of the show. Like, all of this I found to be very progressive for an anime rom-com. And after this setup, a couple things happen in very short succession. Suzuki discovers that Tani, for the first time, is going to be walking home in the same direction as her, and she immediately takes a risk and asks if he wants to walk home with her, and he says yes. And later in their walk, after their hands accidentally brush against each other, Tani actually holds her hand as they're walking. And this was really cool to me for two reasons. Reason number one is that the show makes Tani likable and supportive right away. We glean from the start that he's very quiet and might be socially awkward and might have trouble talking to people. But in spite of that, he's on board with what she asks of him, and he gives her his full attention. And that was a big deal to me because I have seen so many anime shows over the years in which the guy being lusted after by a girl is either completely indifferent to the girl or acts like it's a chore to even be around them. There are many anime shows involving a romance in which the guy doesn't have to put the work in with the girl because the girl just keeps throwing herself at him. But in this case, Tani is receptive to her. He's not dismissive of her at all. It becomes very clear that he has some amount of feelings for her too. And I love that because with the premise of this show, this romance easily could have been set up to be completely one-sided. They easily could have made it so that the show was just Suzuki trying to get Tani and Tani just ignoring her and rinse and repeat. But they didn't do that. They made it so that both people here are actively trying to initiate themselves and make this work, which, if you're a viewer, makes you want to see this work too, because you're not just rooting for Suzuki now, you're rooting for Tani too. But the other reason why I found this so encouraging is that this was an unbelievable amount of romantic progress for the first episode of an anime rom-com. In order to understand what is so special about this episode, you need to know that anime rom-coms are traditionally the slowest moving shows on the face of the earth. It usually takes forever for anything to happen in stories like this. On purpose. Stories like this are usually constructed around the two parties not being able to see eye to eye with each other. And when they finally do see eye to eye and confess their love to each other, it's usually at the very end of the show, because without there being a will they, won't they dynamic, the show usually loses its reason for existing. In other words, these types of shows are more or less designed to be frustrating. They are designed to stall any real progress until the last second. And it's why I came into this show being a pretty big hater of anime rom-coms, because a lot of times, in order to delay the inevitable, shows like this will make their characters so naive or so shy or so close-minded or so stupid that the whole story becomes this endless saga where you feel like nothing's ever happening, or you're seeing the same things happen again and again. And so, for you and I are polar opposites, to not only have their two characters walking home together, but holding hands in the first episode, this was mind-blowing to me, because this was a level of progress that normally doesn't happen until like 80% of the way into a story. Like, no lie, I had just checked out a very popular romantic comedy manga right before I watched this, and I skipped 100 chapters ahead in that manga, and I shit you not, the characters in that manga had made less romantic progress in those 100 chapters than you see in the first 10 minutes of this show. Which is why I found it to be such a breath of fresh air to see this. So, after this happens, there is a major miscommunication the next day at school, because Suzuki isn't ready to admit to her friends that she has feelings for Tani, and she denies it out loud within earshot of Tani. And it bums him out, and he walks away convinced that she doesn't actually like him, and that when she'd asked to walk home with him, he'd somehow misread her intentions. And he even says to Suzuki, forget about yesterday, sorry about all that. And a major misunderstanding like this is a pretty normal thing to happen in a show like this. But in most shows like this, a major misunderstanding can derail the entire show for episodes at a time. There are a lot of romance shows where what would happen after this is that Suzuki would go home and cry and stare out the window while the sun is setting, and then there'd be a shot of Tani also looking out the window sadly, and then they might talk to each other in like 5 episodes or something. Misunderstandings like this are the type of event that can lead to a lot of melodrama in a show like this. And again, it can then become very frustrating to watch shows like this, because all it takes is one misunderstanding that could very easily be resolved through basic communication to completely derail any momentum in the show. Misunderstandings like this can grind a romantic anime series to a screeching halt. But You and I Are Polar Opposites goes in a different direction, because what happens next is that Suzuki reveals to her friends that she loves Tani, and her friends are totally supportive and then encourage her to run after him, which she then does. And I was like, wow, I can't believe how fast and how well the show is moving. Like, all of this was so radically different from how every other anime rom-com I'd ever seen had gone. Even the fact that her friends were super chill and immediately supportive of her admission was really cool to see, and something I don't think I'd ever seen before in an anime. It felt really down to earth. And at this point, I was thoroughly impressed with this episode. I came in with no expectations as a hater of anime rom-coms, and this show was doing everything I could have wanted it to. It wasn't taking itself too seriously. It wasn't being melodramatic. It wasn't sexualizing the characters. The characters weren't doing things that were unrelatable. The characters were being assertive. They weren't being obnoxious or condescending. Everything that everyone was doing made sense and wasn't irrational or dumb. And the story was moving incredibly quickly. It was as though You and I Are Polar Opposites made this first episode specifically for people like me who not only don't normally like anime shows like this, but don't like them for very specific reasons. So, Suzuki runs after Tani and catches up to him. And we're 20 minutes into the episode. The episode is almost over. And when she catches up to him, I remember thinking, okay, she's not gonna actually confess her love to him because that's impossible. That never happens this quickly in shows like this. And yet, she actually does it. She actually confesses her love to him in the very first episode. And I felt like doing a fist pump. I was so psyched at this. I was like, holy crap, they actually did it. They actually put a confession in the first episode, which is incredible because, again, in most anime romance shows, a confession normally doesn't happen until the very, very end of the show, as in, like, the last episode of the show. To see a confession at the start of a show was unthinkable to me. This was a complete subversion of what normally happens in shows like this. And I loved it because shows like this never, ever, ever reward you for watching them as immediately as this show does. And the episode ends with Tani basically saying that he would like to keep talking to her. And the episode closes with it being clear that this is the start of something between them. So, there you go. A wonderful first episode, and something that took me completely by surprise because I'd never even heard of this show when I started watching it. And when I was done watching this, I found myself wondering, what specifically, if I had to pick one thing, is the core element of this episode that makes it not just a great episode, but a great first episode? And I think my answer is that it does something interesting and unexpected that you normally wouldn't get out of a show like this. It differentiates itself from other anime rom-coms at the start by kind of breaking the rules of anime rom-coms. And as a result, You and I Are Polar Opposites has a terrific beginning because not only is there the surprise of there being a confession in the first episode, you get closure with the character just one episode into a series. And that almost never happens in anything this early, but especially anime rom-coms. And that hits on what I think is one of the most common attributes that a lot of great openings have, whether you're talking about an anime or a movie or a game or a book, which is it does something unexpected right away. It does something that is captivating specifically because it's so different from what everything else in its field had been doing, on top of, being well executed. So then I found myself wondering, what other anime shows have I seen that had a first episode that really stood out to me, in the same way that this show did? And after thinking about it, I came up with 5 other anime shows that, to me, had an especially great first episode. And so, in my next video essay, I will discuss those 5 first episodes and elaborate on what I thought was so cool about them. I'm going to give this spin-off musing its own separate video. And the 5 first episodes I mention might not all be as great as the one in You and I Are Polar Opposites, but hey, they're still pretty damn good.